Every station on the frontier had a smell. Kestrel Anchorage smelled like machine grease, brewed chicory, and something faintly sweet that visitors could never quite place until somebody finally guessed it out loud: bread. Someone was always baking bread on Kestrel Anchorage, at odd hours, for no schedule anyone had ever written down, and nobody could remember when it had started or whose idea it had been in the first place. Mireille Okafor liked to walk the outer ring before her shift began. It was the one part of the day that still belonged entirely to her, before the manifests and the maintenance requests and the endless small fires of running a station on the edge of nowhere. She walked past market stalls that hadn't opened yet, their shutters half raised, past the six-fingered hands of an ovashi cook laying dough out on a tray with the unhurried precision of someone who had done it 10,000 times, past a cluster of small furred shapes curled together on a heating vent like a pile of sleeping cats. They weren't cats. They were Ashkelin, and one of them lifted a sleepy head as she passed and blinked at her with pale amber eyes. "Director," the young one said, in the low, buzzing accent of a species that spoke half its words through vibration in the chest rather than through the mouth. "Chew me." She crouched down to the deck, knees cracking a little, and didn't bother pretending she hadn't noticed. "You're supposed to be in the East Dorm." "East Dorm is cold." Chewme's ears flattened, an Ashkelin shrug, as close to one as the species had. "Tarn said I could stay near the reactor vent, if I didn't touch anything." "Tarn says a lot of things." "He also said you'd say that." Chewme's whiskers twitched with something that might have been a grin, if Ashkelin faces did grins, and burrowed back down into the pile with the smug satisfaction of a child who has gotten away with exactly what she planned to get away with. Mireille straightened, joints protesting, and kept walking. 11 years she'd run this station. 11 years of watching children like Chewme grow up believing, with the total, unexamined confidence of childhood, that this rusted, ugly, beloved little ring of metal was simply what the universe looked like: safe, warm near the vents, full of people who knew your name. Kestrel Anchorage was not a large station. It sat on a trade lane connecting 6 minor systems, and touched, at its outer edge, the border of something considerably larger and considerably less friendly: the Vantor Dominion, an empire that had absorbed 40 worlds across 3 centuries and showed no particular sign of considering itself finished. Most of what moved through Anchorage docks was unglamorous cargo: raw ore, hydroponics gel, spare parts, the kind of freight nobody wrote songs about. What made the station unusual wasn't the cargo. It was the crew manifest. Human dockworkers stood shoulder to shoulder with ovashi cooks, Ashkelin engineers, a pair of silent, crystalline Dorith who communicated in pulses of light and had nowhere else in this sector willing to hire them, and one elderly refugee from a species so distant that even Mireille had given up trying to pronounce its proper name years ago and simply called him Walt, a nickname he seemed, against all odds, to genuinely enjoy. None of them had grown up wanting to end up on a trade station at the edge of human space. All of them, somehow, had stayed far longer than they'd ever planned to. Tarnvesk was already in the engineering bay when Mireille reached it, elbow deep in a coupling that had been making an alarming rattling sound for 3 days despite 2 separate repair attempts. He didn't look up when she entered. Ashkelin rarely wasted a greeting on someone they expected to see again within the hour. "The Orzhan freighter is 2 days late," he said instead, by way of hello. "Its transponder pinged from the border checkpoint 6 hours ago." Then nothing. Vantor Customs again. Vantor Customs doesn't usually take 6 hours to stamp a manifest. He finally looked up, and Mireille caught the particular narrowing of his pale amber eyes that wasn't quite worry. Ashkelin didn't do worry the way humans did, not visibly, but with something closer to total, focused attention. Something is different at the border this month. Different how? More ships. Less talk. He wiped both hands on a rag that had been white once, long ago, in some earlier and more optimistic era of the rag's existence. "My cousin runs cargo through that same lane. She says the checkpoints have doubled their crews in the last 6 weeks. Nobody will tell her why. Nobody at the checkpoint will even meet her eyes long enough to lie about it convincingly." Mireille had learned, over 11 years of running the station, that when an Ashkelin engineer said nobody will tell her why, it meant something worth paying attention to. The Ashkelin had spent 4 generations living inside the Vantor Dominion before enough of them scraped together the resources and the courage to leave, and the ones who had left never fully stopped listening to the ones who'd stayed behind. It was, Mireille sometimes thought, the closest thing the frontier had to an early warning system, and it ran on nothing more sophisticated than family calls, gossip, and the simple, stubborn refusal to lose track of your own people. "I'll raise it with the assembly liaison," she said. "In the meantime, Find out what actually happened to that freighter. I don't like ships that just sit. Already asked. Tarn turned back to the coupling, wrench in hand, though his attention was clearly elsewhere. It's still sitting at the checkpoint. Not seized. Not released. Not even boarded, as far as my cousin can tell. Just sitting. Like something upstream of the checkpoint hasn't decided what it wants yet. That was the first crack. Small, easy to miss, the kind of thing that happened on a frontier station every few months and usually meant nothing at all. A bureaucratic snarl, a change of shift, a customs officer with a grudge. Mireille filed it away and went to open the market gates, because whatever was happening at the border, the bread still needed selling, and Kestrel Anchorage still needed to run. She spent the rest of that morning doing the unremarkable work that filled most of her days, signing off on a berth extension for a Dorith trader whose cargo had come in damaged, listening to Walt complain, at great and cheerful length, about the price of imported tea, settling a small dispute between two dockworkers over whose shift had left a crate improperly secured. None of it felt like the beginning of anything. That was, she would think much later, exactly the point of a good day on a frontier station. It never announced itself as the last ordinary one you'd get for a while. At midday, she found Tumi sitting on an upturned crate near the market's edge, carefully, seriously teaching herself to braid a length of packing cord into something that vaguely resembled the elaborate hair ornaments the Ovashi cook wore. For Rasu, Tumi explained, without being asked, holding it up for inspection. Her birthday is next week. Tarn told me humans give gifts on birthdays. Do Ashkelin do that too? I don't actually know, Mireille admitted. You'd have to ask Rasu. I'm not going to ask her. That would ruin it. Tumi went back to her braiding with the fierce concentration of someone solving a genuinely important problem, and Mireille walked on, smiling, thinking that this, a child teaching herself a human custom to surprise an elder from her own species, on a station that belonged, in some quiet and unofficial way, to all of them at once, was worth more than she generally had the words to say out loud. The second crack came 4 days later, and it was not small. Mireille was in the observation lounge that evening, half watching Tumi lose spectacularly at a card game against Walt, a game with rules that seemed to change depending on who was losing, which Mireille suspected was entirely the point, when the proximity alarm cut through the low station chatter like a blade drawn across silk. Every voice in the room stopped at once. On the frontier, alarms were never decorative. Nobody had to be told that twice. She was on the command deck within 90 seconds, breath still catching from the run. The tactical display showed 6 ships dropping out of transit at the edge of the system, arranged in a formation that had nothing casual about it, a cruiser flanked by 5 escorts, holding a tight, disciplined wedge that spoke of drilled precision rather than routine patrol. Dominion configuration. The station system flagged their transponder code in red before Mireille had even finished reading it. They're not slowing for a docking approach, said Sione Faliolo, her security chief, a broad-shouldered man who had spent 20 years keeping Kestrel Anchorage's peace with a firm hand and an unfailingly calm voice, a voice that, right now, had lost most of its calm. They're holding position at the edge of the belt. Weapon systems reading hot across all 6 hulls. Hail them. The reply came almost instantly, as though they had been waiting, patient and unhurried, for the invitation. A voice filled the command deck, flat, measured, the voice of someone who had never once had to raise it to be obeyed. Kestrel Anchorage, this is Commander Eilith Corvain of the Vantor Dominion vessel Ashen Verdict. By order of the Third Ring Authority, this station, and all persons of Vantor origin currently residing aboard it are placed under Dominion jurisdiction, effective immediately. You will prepare to receive an inspection party within the hour. Resist, and you will be considered in violation of Dominion border law. Mireille exchanged a look with Sione, and for one long, silent second neither of them said anything at all. Persons of Vantor origin. There was only one community aboard this station that phrase could possibly mean, and Mireille felt the floor of the evening shift out from under her, quietly and completely, the way it does the instant you understand that the ordinary day you are having has already ended. Do we respond? Sione asked, already reaching for the console, his hand hovering rather than moving, waiting for her word. Acknowledge receipt. Nothing more. Mireille kept her eyes on the tactical display, on the 6 red shapes holding their disciplined wedge at the edge of the belt, patient in the way only something with overwhelming force ever needed to be. Buy us time to think before we buy them anything else. Behind her, the observation lounge had gone from a room full of card games to a room full of silence, the kind that spreads through a station faster than any alarm ever could, because everyone aboard had learned, at some point in their own history, exactly what it meant when 6 warships showed up asking for people by category instead of by name. Tumi had gone very still in her seat, and Walt had, without seeming to think about it at all, moved his chair a half-step closer to hers. Word moved through Kestrel Anchorage faster than any official announcement ever could, the way word always moved on a station where everyone ate in the same 3 canteens and nobody had anywhere private to keep a secret. By the time Mireille reached engineering, half the station's Ashkelin crew was already gathered there, a tight, silent cluster pressed close around Tarn, the way small animals gather in bad weather. "They can't do this," said one of the older engineers, a woman named Rasu who had left Vantor space 30 years ago and carried, on both forearms, faded scars she had never once explained and no one had ever asked her to. "We hold Anchorage residency. We are assembly registered. We are not Dominion citizens, whatever they choose to write on a form." "The Dominion doesn't recognize that we ever stopped being citizens," Tarn said quietly, without looking up from the data slate in his hands. "That's the entire purpose of the phrase they used. It doesn't ask permission before claiming something back. It never has." Tumi had pushed her way into the middle of the cluster, ears flattened, small body trembling with an anxiety no 11-year-old should have to carry, and Mireille felt something in her own chest pull tight at the sight of it. Tumi had arrived on their station as an infant refugee the same year Mireille had taken command. She had never known any home but this one, had never once had to learn what it meant to be property, and Mireille intended, with a ferocity that surprised even her, to make sure that remained true. "They're not taking anyone," Mireille said, and was startled by how flat and absolute her own voice sounded in her ears. "Not while I have breath left to argue otherwise." "With respect, Director," Rasu said, not unkindly, "you have a security detail of 11 people and a station defense grid that hasn't been upgraded since before I arrived. They have 6 warships. Respect doesn't stop a plasma lance." "No," Mireille agreed. "It doesn't. But I have something else, and I intend to use every scrap of it before I let this station or anyone on it be handed over on a manifest." She didn't say, out loud, what that something else was, because in that moment she genuinely wasn't certain. But she had spent 11 years building the station on a working theory she had never before been forced to test at gunpoint, that a place which treated every species aboard it as fully, immediately, unquestionably belonging would end up owing very little to force, and a very great deal to loyalty. It was a slow kind of strength, unglamorous, and hard to point to on a tactical display. It had never once had to prove itself against 6 warships. She was about to find out whether it could. Commander Eilith Corvain came aboard 4 hours later at the head of an inspection party of 12, and Mireille met her personally at the airlock, because that was what you did when armed strangers arrived at your door with an ultimatum in their mouth. You looked them in the eye, and you made them say whatever they had to say directly to your face, not to a screen. Corvain was tall even by Vantor standards, pale grey-skinned, with the faintly luminous eyes common to the Dominion's ruling caste and an expression that had clearly, at some point in a long and successful career, been arranged into a permanent, mild contempt for whatever room she happened to be standing in. Director Okafor. Corvain inclined her head exactly as far as protocol required, and not 1 degree further. "You run a tidy station. Small. Efficient. I am told humans favor efficiency over ambition on this stretch of frontier." "We favor not getting shot at," Mireille said. "You've placed a claim on residents who hold Anchorage citizenship. Commander, I'd like to understand the legal basis before this goes any further than an inspection." "The legal basis," Corvain said, with the patience of someone repeating a sentence she had clearly already repeated at several other stations that same month, "is that the Ashkelin are Vantor stock, wherever in the galaxy they happen to be standing at the time we come looking. The Dominion is conducting a census of dispersed populations along this border. Compliance is not optional, and it is not, I would add, a punishment. It is simply an accounting of what already belongs to us." "They are not property," Mireille said. "They are staff. Neighbors. In at least one case, a child who was born on this station and has never set foot anywhere in Vantor space in her life." "Then the census will note that," Corvain said, unmoved, "and the Dominion will decide, as it always does, what to do with the information." Her gaze moved, deliberately, past Mireille's shoulder to where Sione and 2 other security staff stood at a respectful but very present distance, hands visibly empty and visibly ready. You have no fleet, Director. You have a rusted hull and perhaps 40,000 tons of cargo capacity. I would encourage you to consider carefully what resistance would actually accomplish here, beyond making an already unpleasant week considerably worse for everyone aboard. I'm not resisting anything yet, Mireille said. I'm asking questions. In my experience, Commander, that's usually how small stations survive long enough to become merely annoying instead of interesting to people like you. Something flickered behind Corvain's luminous eyes. Not concern, not quite, but the smallest recalibration, the look of someone filing away a data point that didn't quite fit the report she'd already half written in her head before she'd even boarded. You have 3 days, she said, to compile a full manifest of Vantor origin persons aboard this station. During that period, the Ashen Verdict and its escorts will remain in system. I would call this a courtesy, Director. Most census actions along this border do not arrive with any warning at all. She turned to go, then paused at the threshold of the airlock, almost as an afterthought, the way a predator sometimes glances back simply to enjoy the effect of what it has already said. You should know this station is not unique in receiving this notice. 11 others along this border are being served the same order this month. The Dominion has decided that the drift of dispersed populations away from their origin has gone on long enough. We are simply calling our own people home. Before she turned to go, Mireille asked one more question, mostly to see what Corvain would do with it. What happens to the people on your manifest who refuse to be counted, Commander? Corvain looked at her the way one might look at a child asking whether the sky could simply choose not to be blue. Refusal is not a category the census recognizes. There is compliance, and there is insurrection. I'd advise your residents to remain firmly within the first category. She did not wait for a response before stepping back through the airlock, 12 Marines falling into step behind her without a word, the whole party moving with the unhurried certainty of people who had never once had to consider what it might mean for someone to simply say no. The airlock sealed behind the inspection party with a low, final hiss, and Mireille stood there a long moment afterward, turning that last sentence over and over, feeling the true shape of it settle into place. 11 others. This wasn't one freighter, or one station, or even one runaway engineer's grudge against the empire that had owned his grandmother. This was a border-wide operation, coordinated and deliberate. And if it was border-wide, no clever answer given at one airlock, however satisfying, was going to be enough to end it. She was going to need help from further away than she had ever before had reason to ask for it. The message she sent that night didn't go to the Assembly liaison, and it didn't go to Earth. It went instead to a contact she had cultivated for 6 quiet years and never once had cause to actually call upon, a retired Ashkelin merchant named Costa, who lived 2 jumps distant and who was connected, through a decades-old web of family debts and quiet favors nobody outside the community ever heard about, to nearly every Ashkelin household still living inside Vantor borders. Corvain is calling this a census, she wrote. 11 stations, all at once, all on the same order. I don't think it's a census. I think it's a supply problem, and I think the Ashkelin are the supply. Tell me I'm wrong. The reply arrived within the hour, which told her something all on its own. Costa did not answer quickly unless the matter genuinely mattered. You're not wrong, and it's worse than you think. Word from inside Dominion space. The shipyards at Corvith and Anselm's Reach have been running double shifts for almost 2 years now. Something is being built at a scale nobody's seen in a generation, and it needs hands that already know engineering, don't require years of training, and, critically, hands the Dominion considers property rather than employees who might ask for a raise or a contract. That's us. It's always, eventually, been us. Do you know what's being built? Not yet. But I know several people who might, if I'm careful about how I ask. Mireille read it twice and did not like the shape it was taking. She called Tan to her office an hour before her own shift should have ended, and by the time he arrived she had already pulled up the border sector charts, the ones marked, over 3 decades, with the quiet handwritten notations of frontier traders, which lanes were watched, which weren't, which Vantor officers could be reasoned with and which absolutely could not. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need an honest answer, even if the honest answer makes both of us uncomfortable in this room. Tan's ears went very still. Ask. If the Dominion is conscripting Ashkelin labor at scale, not just here, but border-wide, what does the Ashkelin community still living inside Vantor space actually think of us? Of Anchorage? Of me, specifically, since I'm the one who's about to make decisions on their behalf whether they like it or not. It was not the question Tarn had braced for. He was quiet long enough that Mireille genuinely thought she'd have to ask it a second time. They think, he said at last, that Anchorage is the only place in this whole sector where an Ashkelin child grows up believing she's simply a person, and not a debt someone else is owed. They think that because it's true, and they've watched it be true for 11 years now, through people who send word back the way Costa Rain just did for you. My grandmother worked in a Vantor shipyard for 40 years and was never once, in 40 years, asked her own name by a single officer. I have known you 11 years, Director, and you have never once forgotten mine, or Chumi's, or Rasu's, or anyone else's who's ever walked onto your dock with nowhere left to go. That's not the same thing as an army, Tarn. No, he agreed evenly. It isn't an army. It's a few 100,000 people who have spent their entire lives being told they matter only as parts inside someone else's machine, and who have watched, from a careful, cautious distance, one small station quietly prove that isn't the only way a life can go. He looked at her directly, amber eyes steady in the low office light. You asked what they think of you. I'll tell you instead what they do for you, if it ever came to it. Word travels faster through Ashkelin family lines than through any Dominion communication relay ever built, because we built those lines out of nothing but care, over 100 years, without once asking the Dominion's permission to build them. Corvain doesn't know that network exists. She's never had to know. Nobody who owns people ever bothers to ask what the people they own have been quietly building underneath them, in the hours nobody's watching. Mireille sat back slowly, feeling something settle into place in her chest. Not certainty, not yet, but the first outline of a plan. It had arrived not from a strategist, not from a diplomat, but from an engineer who had spent the last decade fixing stubborn couplings and letting a refugee child sleep by a reactor vent because the east dorm ran cold, and who had apparently been carrying, the whole time, a far larger inheritance than anyone aboard had guessed. Costa Rain thinks something is being built in the Vantor shipyards, she said. Something that needs a great many trained hands, quickly. Can your network find out exactly what? Tarn was already reaching for his comm unit. They can find out anything they set their minds to, he said, standing. The question was never whether we could learn the truth, Director. It was only ever whether anyone up here would eventually bother to ask us for it. He paused at the door, one hand on the frame, and for a moment the composed engineer Mireille had worked beside for a decade looked, briefly, like the frightened refugee child he must once have been, arriving on some other dock with nothing but a name nobody up there had bothered to learn. My grandmother used to say the Dominion's real cruelty was never the shipyards, he said quietly. It was that after 40 years, she still had to introduce herself every single morning to people who had worked beside her for 4 decades, as if she reset to nothing overnight, every night, in their eyes. I think that's the part Corvain doesn't understand yet. It isn't the labor we mind losing. It's being forgotten on purpose, over and over, by people who could easily choose not to forget and simply decide it isn't worth the effort. You're not going to be forgotten here, Mireille said. Not while I'm running this station. I know. Tarn's ears settled, the closest thing to a smile his face allowed. That's rather the whole reason any of us are still willing to fight for it. The answer came back 2 days later, relayed through 4 separate Ashkelin households and 1 shipping clerk who risked her position to pull a manifest she wasn't cleared to see, and it landed on Mireille's desk with a flat, dread-inducing weight of confirmation. The Dominion was building an armed logistics fleet, not warships in the traditional sense, but heavily escorted convoy carriers, fast and enormous hold, designed to move refined or unfinished industrial components at a scale the sector hadn't seen since the last major expansion push. Every leaked schematic described the same intended cargo class, and every projected loading manifest pointed, with grim consistency, to exactly the kind of frontier trade stations the census notices had just targeted. Kestrel Anchorage was not being annexed for its Ashkelin residents. It was being annexed for its industrial capacity, its docks, its position on the lane, and the residency claim was simply the legal costume that made the seizure look tidy on a report somewhere in the Third Ring Authority's files. They're not calling us home, Rasu said flatly, when Mireille laid it out for the senior staff crowded into the small conference room off the command deck. They're calling the station home. We are just the paperwork that makes the seizure legal. Which means, Sione said, jaw tight, in 3 days Corvain isn't collecting a census. She's taking the entire station, dock and all, and every soul standing on it. Mireille had known, somewhere beneath the surface of her thinking, since the moment Corvain had said 11 others, that this was never going to end with a compliant manifest handed politely across a desk. But knowing the shape of a threat and knowing what, specifically, to do about it were entirely different animals, and she spent that night not sleeping at all, walking the outer ring the way she always did, past the shuttered market stalls, past the smell of bread someone insisted on baking even now, at the worst possible hour, as if the universe hadn't noticed anything was wrong. She found Tumi awake, curled against the reactor vent, not sleeping either. Are they going to take us? Tumi asked, without preamble, the way children ask exactly the question adults have spent the whole evening carefully avoiding. No, Mireille said, and meant it completely, though she had no clear idea yet how she was going to make that true. Tarn says his cousin knows people inside the shipyards, Tumi went on, small voice steady in the dark. People who build the things Corvain wants. He says they don't want to build them, either. Her ears twitched. He says the Dominion thinks strength means having the biggest gun. He says humans think strength is something else, but he wouldn't tell me what. He said you'd know. Mireille thought about that for a long time after Tumi finally drifted off against her shoulder. She thought about 11 years of hiring anyone who showed up on her dock with nowhere else to go, and no question ever asked about where, exactly, they'd come from or what they'd left behind. She thought about a network that had built itself, patiently, out of nothing but decades of unglamorous kindness, bread shared at odd hours, breaks that were never begrudged, names that were never forgotten, running silently underneath an empire that had never once bothered to look for it, because empires that measure strength in warships rarely think to measure it in trust. She thought, too, about the decision she was quietly arriving at, and understood, with a strange, settling calm, that it would matter more than anything Corvain's inspection party had threatened at the airlock. She was not going to fight the Dominion with a fleet she didn't have and never would. She was going to let an empire that had spent 3 centuries treating people as inventory discover, all at once, exactly how many of those people had spent the same 3 centuries quietly, invisibly deciding otherwise. In the morning, she called Costa Rain again. I need you to send one message, she said. Not to me. To every Ashkelin household still working in a Vantor shipyard along this border. Tell them Kestrel Anchorage is not going to be seized quietly. Tell them if they want to help, the safest possible thing they can do is exactly what they've always done. Nothing dramatic, nothing that puts a single life at risk. Just slow. Slower loading. Slower manifests. Slower everything, everywhere, all at once, for exactly as long as it takes. Costa Rain was quiet on the line for a long moment. That isn't a battle plan, Director. No, Mireille agreed. It's a strike. The Dominion has never had to survive one, because it's never once occurred to them that the people building their fleet might simply, quietly stop cooperating, all together, all at once, without ever raising a single weapon. She paused, watching the sunrise cycle brighten slowly across the observation port. Corvain thinks we have a rusted hull and 40,000 tons of cargo. She's wrong about the cargo. She's about to find out exactly what 40,000 tons of cargo means when the people moving it decide, together, on the very same day, to move it a great deal more slowly than usual. Before she signed off, she called Sione and Rasu into the office as well, and laid out, as plainly as she could, exactly what she'd asked Costa Rain to do and exactly what she hadn't. Nobody on this station is ordering anyone inside Vantor space to do anything, she said. I want that understood clearly, by everyone, before this goes any further. Costa Rain is passing along a request, not a command. Whoever answers it is choosing to, on their own terms, and they're the only ones who get to decide what risk that's worth to them. Rasu considered that for a long moment, arms crossed, the old scars on her forearms catching the office light. You understand what you're actually asking, Director. Every household that slows a shipment down is a household the Dominion could, in theory, eventually trace and punish, if they ever decide to look hard enough. I understand it, Mireille said, which is exactly why it isn't my call to make for them. It's yours, and Tarn's, and Costa Rain's, and every family out there who has to weigh what they're willing to risk. All I'm doing is telling the truth about what's coming for this station, and trusting people to decide for themselves what they want to do about it. That's the only kind of asking I know how to do honestly. Sione exhaled slowly. And if nobody answers? Then we face 11 warships with a rusted hull and 40,000 tons of cargo. Exactly the way Corvain expects us to, Mireille said. But I don't think that's going to be the problem, Sione. I think the problem is going to be that too many people answer, and we spend the next year making sure none of them pay for it. Commander Eilith Corvain returned to Kestrel Anchorage precisely on schedule, 3 days after her first visit, with a full occupation force behind her rather than an inspection party. The Ashen verdict had been joined by 4 additional cruisers. The station sensors counted 11 ships now holding position in system, enough to make the earlier 6 look, in retrospect, like a courtesy call. She did not bother with pleasantries this time. Director Okafor, your census compliance window has closed. Corvain's voice carried through the command deck with the flat certainty of someone reading from a script she had already read aloud on 10 other stations that same month. I am authorized to take administrative control of this facility, and of all persons and industrial assets aboard it, effective upon my arrival. Resistance will be treated as an act of Dominion insurrection, and dealt with accordingly. You should know, Mireille said, that we are not resisting. Corvain's expression didn't move, but something in her stance did. That same small recalibration as before, the look of a woman who had braced for an argument and been handed silence in its place. Then this will be brief. It will, Mireille agreed, though perhaps not quite the way you're expecting it to go. The occupation force boarded within the hour. Vantor Marines moved through Kestrel Anchorage corridors with the practiced, unhurried efficiency of soldiers who had done exactly this on 10 other stations that same month, securing the command deck, the reactor core, the cargo bays, the market ring itself. Nobody resisted. Nobody so much as raised a voice above a murmur. Mireille had ordered every staff member, human and Ashkelin and Ovashi and Doroth alike, to comply fully with every instruction and offer no obstruction of any kind, and the Marines moved through a station that gave them nothing whatsoever to push against, no resistance to justify a single shot fired, no defiance to make an example of. For the first 6 hours, it should have felt, to Corvain, like a total and uncomplicated victory. It did. She toured the docks personally that first afternoon, inspecting the cargo bays with the brisk satisfaction of someone confirming an inheritance long overdue, and remarked to her adjutant that the station's industrial output, once properly integrated into Dominion logistics, could clear this year's shortfall along the entire southern shipping corridor within 18 months. It was, by every metric she had ever been trained to measure success, a clean and efficient seizure. No shots fired. No casualties. No formal resistance logged anywhere in the record. She allowed herself, for perhaps the first time since receiving this assignment, a moment of quiet professional pride. Then the reports started arriving from the shipyards. Mireille wasn't present for any of that, of course. She learned of it only later, in fragments, relayed back through Costa Rain's network with the particular satisfaction of people finally watching a plan bear fruit after decades of simply, quietly living their lives. But the shape of it was simple enough to picture. Across a dozen Vantor shipyards along the border, on the same day, in 100 small and individually unremarkable ways, everything slowed. A loading crew that had always moved briskly suddenly needed twice the time to certify a cargo manifest, citing an abundance of caution nobody could technically fault them for. A team of Ashkelin fabricators, who had quietly built a decade-long reputation for working straight through their scheduled breaks without complaint, discovered, apparently all on the same shift, that they were, after all, entitled to those breaks, and took every single one of them, precisely on time, for the first time in 10 years. Supply requisitions that used to clear within an hour took a full day. Nothing broke. Nothing was sabotaged. Nothing gave a single officer grounds to point at one culpable name and call it insurrection. It was simply, everywhere at once, exactly as slow as a workforce that had never once been asked whether it wanted to help build the fleet that would be used to seize Kestrel Anchorage. Aboard Kestrel Anchorage itself, the occupation settled into a strange, suspended rhythm that felt almost, but never quite, like ordinary life. Vantor Marines stood posted at the dock and the reactor access and the command deck, correct and disciplined and entirely unnecessary, since nobody gave them any reason to be otherwise. A young Marine assigned to the market ring found himself, on the second day, standing awkwardly near the bread stall while the Ovashi cook, apparently unbothered by the rifle slung across his back, handed him a warm roll anyway, the way she handed one to everyone who lingered near her stall long enough to look hungry. He took it. He didn't know what else to do. He ate it standing at attention, and came back the next morning at the same hour, off duty this time, and paid for the second one, and didn't tell his commanding officer either time. It was a small thing. Mireille heard about it secondhand, days later, and thought about it for a long while afterward. How strange and stubborn kindness could be, how it kept finding cracks to grow through even under armed occupation, even between people who had every official reason to treat each other as enemies. Corvain received her first report of the slowdown 11 hours into the occupation, dismissed it as coincidence, and received 4 more reports before that same day was finished. By the second day, the Ashken's own resupply requisition, the one meant to provision the occupation force currently sitting on Kestrel Anchorage Zone dock, had been delayed at its point of origin by a full shift, for reasons nobody in the chain could quite pin down, file through channels nobody could quite trace back to any single culpable clerk. Corvain summoned Mireille to what had, until 3 days ago, been Mireille's own office. "Explain this," Corvain said, sliding a data slate across the desk. It showed a compressed summary of production delays across 11 separate Dominion facilities, all beginning within the same 48-hour window, with no common cause the Dominion's own analysts could identify. "I don't have access to Dominion shipyard schedules, Commander," Mireille said, which was, strictly speaking, entirely true. "You expect me to believe this is unrelated to your station seizure." "I expect you to believe whatever the evidence actually tells you," Mireille said. "I'd point out that I've been sitting under Vantor occupation for 2 days now and haven't sent a single transmission you weren't already monitoring in real time. Whatever is happening in your shipyards 3 systems away, it isn't coming from me, and it certainly isn't coming from this office." It was, technically, also true. It hadn't come from her office at all. It had come from 100,000 small, individual decisions, made by people who had spent their entire lives being told their labor belonged to someone else, discovering all at once that it did not have to. Corvain studied her for a long moment, and for the first time since boarding, something like genuine uncertainty crossed her pale features. "Who are you people?" she said, not really a question at all, that an empire of 40 worlds cannot even seize one trade station without its own workforce quietly falling apart 3 systems away, for no cause any investigator can name. Mireille thought of 11 years, and Tumi asleep by the reactor vent, and Tarn's steady amber eyes saying nobody who owns people ever bothers to ask what the people they own are quietly building underneath them. "We are not doing anything to you, Commander," she said. "We are just the first place along this border that let people practice being something other than property. It turns out, given enough time, that's contagious." By the 4th day of the occupation, the slowdown had a name inside the Dominion's own command structure, though nobody wanted to be the officer who first committed that name to an official report. It looked, to anyone reading the pattern honestly, exactly like a coordinated labor action spanning 11 separate facilities and thousands of individuals at once, except that a coordinated labor action required organization, and organization required a leader, a meeting, a manifesto, some single throat that could be found and squeezed. Every investigation the Dominion launched came back entirely empty. There was no ringleader to arrest. There was no order given, no signal sent, nothing that would ever show up on a communications intercept. There was only a network of family relationships and quiet loyalties, built for decades with no purpose in mind beyond simple decency, that had turned out, without anyone ever intending it as a weapon, to be exactly that. Corvain's superiors were losing patience faster than Corvain herself was losing composure, though hers, too, was fraying at the edges. The fleet resupply that should have kept 11 cruisers comfortably provisioned for a month had stretched thin by the 5th day, and the Ashken's own quartermaster reported, with visible and unhappy discomfort, that 2 of the escort ships were now running low on components that simply had not shipped from their origin shipyard, for reasons still officially under investigation and unofficially understood by absolutely no one who was willing to say so out loud. It was on the 6th day that Tarn Vesk did the one thing Mireille had specifically not asked him to do, and had also, in some quiet corner of her own mind, half hoped he might. He requested a private meeting with Commander Corvain. Alone. No escort, no witnesses, no permission sought from Mireille beforehand. She found out only after it had already happened, when Sione came to her wearing an expression she hadn't seen on his face in 11 years of working beside him. He walked onto the command deck and asked for her by name, Sione said. Nobody stopped him. Half the occupation force just watched him walk past like they'd never seen an Ashkelin do that before, which, I suppose they hadn't. What did he say to her? I don't know every word, but I know how it ended, because half the command deck heard the end of it whether they wanted to or not. Sione hesitated, choosing his words with the same care he used when diffusing an actual standoff. He told her his grandmother worked 40 years in a Vantor shipyard and was never once, in 40 years, asked her own name. He told her that every Ashkelin family in this sector has spent decades quietly, separately deciding that their children would not live the same life their grandmothers had. And then he told her that the slowdown she's investigating isn't a conspiracy she can arrest her way out of, because it isn't a conspiracy at all. It's simply what happens when you spend 3 centuries treating people like spare parts, and one day enough of those parts realize, all at roughly the same time, that they don't have to keep pretending the machine matters more than they do. Mireille absorbed that in silence, feeling something in her chest that was equal parts pride and fear for what it might have cost him to say it. And then, Sione went on. He told her something else. He told her the Dominion still has a choice here. It can keep escalating against a network it cannot see, cannot arrest, and cannot outrun, or it can withdraw from Kestrel Anchorage and let the slowdown end exactly the way it began, quietly, without anyone in the Dominion command structure ever having to admit, on the record, what actually happened along this border in the space of a single week. Sione went quiet for a moment, remembering. There was one more thing, he added. Right before he left the command deck, Corvain asked him why he'd risk his own standing to say any of it to her face, when he could have just as easily said nothing and let the slowdown speak for itself. He told her, and I remember this part clearly, because half the Marines standing guard actually stopped to listen, that his grandmother spent 40 years being invisible to people who had every opportunity to see her and simply didn't bother. He said he wasn't going to spend his own life the same way, waiting for someone else to decide whether he was worth being seen. If he was going to matter to the outcome of this, he wanted it to be because he chose to matter, not because a network he never asked to be born into made the choice for him. That's not his call to make on behalf of this station, Mireille said, though there was no real heat left in it by the time the words came out. No, Sione agreed. But it might be the only offer Corvain is going to get that lets her walk away from this without a formal insurrection written into her service record. And I think, Director, she already knows that. Corvain summoned Mireille one final time that evening. She looked, for the first time since her arrival, genuinely tired, not defeated, not quite yet, but tired in the particular way of an officer who has begun to understand, slowly and against every instinct of her training, that the fight in front of her cannot be won by any method she was ever taught to use. Your engineer made an interesting proposal, she said. He's not in the habit of speaking for this station without asking me first. No, Corvain said. That was rather the point of what he said, I think. She turned the data slate over in her hands without looking at it, her gaze fixed instead on some point past Mireille's shoulder. I was sent here to secure an industrial asset and a labor pool the Dominion considers rightfully its own. I was not sent here to manage a border-wide production collapse with no identifiable cause and not one arrestable party anywhere in the chain. My superiors will not thank me for turning the first assignment into the second. Then don't let it become the second, Mireille said simply. Withdraw. The moment this occupation ends, the slowdown ends with it, quietly, the same way it started. Nobody has to write a report explaining what actually happened, because officially, nothing happened at all. Nobody broke a law. Nobody raised a weapon. A trade station simply became, for 1 week, a great deal less convenient to occupy than it appeared to be from a distance. Corvain was quiet for a long moment, longer than any pause she'd allowed herself in the entire week. You understand this doesn't end anything, she said finally. The Dominion will not forget that a network like this exists, once it's been shown to it. There will be another census, another year, another border, somewhere further out. Maybe, Mireille said, but you'll go into that one already knowing what you didn't know a week ago. And I think, Commander, that knowledge is worth considerably more to you right now than one station's cargo capacity. The Ashen verdict and its escorts broke orbit on the 8th day, without ceremony and without any official acknowledgement of anything that had happened, exactly as Mireille had said they would. The occupation force withdrew from the station's corridors in the same efficient, wordless silence with which it had arrived. No apology was offered. None had ever really been expected. Mireille stood on the observation deck and watched 11 Dominion warships shrink to points of light and vanish, one by one, into transit, and felt none of the triumph she might once have imagined feeling. Mostly she felt tired, bone deep, and hollowed out, and mostly she felt something else that took her a long while to name, and when she finally did name it, it surprised her, gratitude, not for a victory won, but for the simple, accumulated fact of every small kindness that had ever been extended aboard this station by someone who never once thought of it as strategy. Tarn found her there an hour later, footsteps quiet on the deck plating. You went to Corvain without telling me, she said, not quite an accusation, though it had started as one. I know. He didn't apologize for it, and didn't pretend he'd meant to. You built something here without ever knowing what it might become. Director. I thought it was fair that I get to decide, once in my life, what to do with it, without asking your permission first. My grandmother never got to decide a single thing about her own life, start to finish. I wanted, just this once, to make a decision with that same weight, and make it entirely for myself. Mireille understood that better than she let herself say aloud. Did you mean it? She asked instead. What you told her, about the machine never mattering more than the people caught inside it. Every word. Tarn's ears settled, calm now, the tension of the last 8 days finally draining out of his small frame all at once, visibly, like a held breath released. I've carried it in me a long time, Director. I simply never had anyone worth saying it to before you gave me a reason. Below them, in the market ring, someone was baking bread again, the smell drifting up through the ventilation the way it always did, entirely oblivious to the fact that an Empire's warships had only just left orbit an hour before. Tumi was there too, visible even from the observation deck, sitting cross-legged by a stall, arguing happily with Walt over the rules of a card game neither of them had ever fully understood, exactly as if nothing at all had happened, because for her, in the way that mattered most, nothing had. Nothing had happened, officially, anywhere in the record. That, Mireille thought, watching the ring settle back into its ordinary evening rhythm, was the strangest part of the whole affair, a battle fought and won entirely in the negative space of official history, in 10,000 small decisions nobody would ever write into a report, because not one of those decisions had broken a single law along the way. Word of what happened at Kestrel Anchorage moved through the frontier the way word always moved on stations like this one, unofficially, imprecisely, mostly by mouth, and considerably faster than anything the Assembly's own diplomatic channels ever managed to file. Within a month, 3 other stations along the border, facing their own quiet census notices, had reached out to Mireille directly, not for weapons, not for warships, but for the name of an old Ashkelin merchant who apparently knew how to make an Empire's own shipyards forget, briefly and without any explanation anyone could pin down, how to hurry. Costa Rain found himself, somewhat to his own bemusement, running what several frontier administrators had started calling, without much originality, but with considerable and growing affection, the Anchorage method. It wasn't a weapon. It had never been designed as one, and nobody involved would have called it that even now. It was simply the accumulated, decades-long habit of treating displaced people as people, finally, briefly, and without anyone's original permission, allowed to show what it had been quietly capable of all along. The Dominion, for its part, never issued another mass census notice along that stretch of border. Whether that was Corvain's report working its slow way up through channels Mireille would never see, or simply a quiet institutional decision that some assets weren't, in the end, worth the trouble of seizing, she never learned, and didn't especially need to. Some things were better left unconfirmed, the same way the slowdown itself had been, a fact everyone along the border eventually came to understand and nobody in Dominion uniform ever officially admitted, which was, in the end, exactly how it needed to remain if it was going to keep working the next time. Costa Rain called her once more, a few weeks after the withdrawal, this time simply to talk rather than to warn her of anything. You should know, he said, that nobody out here thinks of what happened as a victory, exactly. Too many people spent that week frightened for their families to call it that. But they talk about it as proof. Proof that the thing we've all been quietly building for decades, one kindness at a time, was never as fragile as it looked from the outside. I've had 3 households this month ask me how to start something like it themselves, somewhere else along the border. I don't entirely know what to tell them, except that it took you 11 years and you never once set out to build a weapon. You just kept opening the dock. Tell them that, then, Mireille said. Tell them it's slower than they'll want it to be, and it doesn't feel like anything at all for a very long time, and then one day it turns out to have been the only thing that mattered. 6 months later, a small, battered courier ship requested docking clearance at Kestrel Anchorage, flying no flag Mireille recognized on sight. Its single passenger disembarked wearing a Vantor Dominion uniform with the insignia carefully, deliberately removed, the thread still showing where it had been unpicked by hand rather than cut. Eilith Corvain stood at the airlock the way Mireille had once stood there herself, and for a long moment neither woman said a single word. I resigned my commission, Corvain said finally. There's no place left for me in a fleet whose officers can't explain, even privately to themselves, why an empire of 40 worlds couldn't hold one trade station for 8 days. She looked past Mireille, toward the market ring, toward the smell of bread drifting faintly down the corridor. I came to see it for myself. Whatever it is you've actually built here, that no report I ever filed could adequately describe. It's not a weapon, Mireille said. I want to be entirely clear about that, in case some part of you was hoping otherwise. I know, Corvain said quietly. That's rather why I came. She hesitated, an unfamiliar gesture, clearly, on a woman who had spent an entire career never once hesitating in front of anyone. I spent 40 years believing strength meant having more ships than whoever stood across from you. I would like, if you'll permit it, to spend whatever years I have left understanding the other kind. Mireille stepped aside from the airlock, the way she had for 11 years, for anyone at all who had ever shown up on her dock with nowhere else left to go. Kestrel Anchorage doesn't ask where anyone came from, she said. It never has. That's rather the entire point of the place. Somewhere below, in the market ring, Tumi was teaching a new arrival, a young Dorith refugee who had come in on last week's freighter, pulses of nervous light still flickering uncertainly across her crystalline shoulders, the same card game she had once lost, badly and cheerfully, to Walt. The light of a dozen different species laughter spilled up through the corridors of a small, rusted, unglamorous station that had never once needed a fleet to prove what it was actually worth, and never would. Corvain stayed 3 days. She spent most of them simply walking the ring the way Mireille always had, watching the market open and close, sitting once, awkwardly, at the edge of a card game she didn't understand, listening more than she spoke. On her last morning, she found Mireille at the same react event where, 6 months earlier, a frightened engineer had once told a child that humans thought strength was something other than the biggest gun, and had refused, even to his own director, to say exactly what. I still don't fully understand it, Corvain admitted. How something this small, this unarmed, could matter more than 11 warships. It doesn't matter more than 11 warships, Mireille said. It just doesn't need them to still be here in 11 years, the way your warships needed to leave in 8 days. That's the whole difference, Commander. We were never trying to win a fight. We were just never planning to stop showing up for each other, long after any fight was over. It turns out that outlasts almost everything, if you give it enough time. Corvain left the next morning, the same battered courier ship carrying her onward to wherever a Dominion officer without a commission goes to build whatever came next for her. Mireille never learned where. She hoped, in the quiet way she hoped for most things now, that it was somewhere with a dock that opened for anyone who showed up with nowhere else to go. The Dominion had spent 3 centuries measuring the galaxy in warships built and worlds conquered. It had taken a station nobody outside its own trade lane had ever heard of, in a single week, to teach it the one measurement it had never once thought to make: how much strength quietly accumulates, unarmed and entirely unannounced, in every person simply allowed to belong. By the time the Dominion understood what Kestrel Anchorage actually was, it had already stopped mattering whether it understood it at all. The bread kept baking at odd hours. The dock kept opening for anyone who arrived with nowhere else to go. And somewhere along a long, quiet border, 100,000 small kindnesses kept doing, patiently and without a single fanfare, what no fleet in that sector had ever managed to do, holding a line that never needed defending, because nobody had ever thought to build a weapon that could break it in the first place.